Dr. David Mitten of Answers in Genesis is going to ask him a little about Lucy and her body. Lucy, a supposed transitional form of sorts. And so how can you not play the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, where we're going to talk to Dr. David Mitten, who was an associate professor of anatomy at Washington University School of Medicine from 1966 to the year 2000, and has since become associate professor emeritus. David was a consulting editor in histology from Stedman's Medical Dictionary, which is a standard medical reference work. And he's also now very involved with the Creation Museum in the Cincinnati area, where he works on new exhibits and gives workshops 4 days a week. So a busy man. This is what retirement looks like for Dr. David Mitten. Dr. David Mitten, we're so glad to have you on Backpack Radio. Anything else you want to share a little bit about your background before we start asking you some hardcore questions?
Well, no, I think you've pulled it all together. That's pretty much my background, and enjoy my work here, my retirement here.
All right, well, thank you.
I'll keep working. I might add that I don't know if you're aware of this, but Lucy was actually, the fossil Lucy actually was named after the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
Oh, yeah, that's why we're playing some Lucy. Yeah. I heard that it was blaring from the camp speakers when they found her there, I believe, in 1973.
1973, 74. It was a couple of years over which they found the specimen.
All right, well, tell us a little bit about, we're going to do these bite-sized questions, so don't worry, I'll get to the other important things about Lucy. But first, in the shortest way you can, tell us, who is Lucy?
Lucy is an ape.
All right.
That's the shortest answer. And
That's
by the way,
start.
The scientific name for Lucy is Australopithecus, and that translates southern ape, Australo-southern-pithecus ape.
Wow.
She is an ape.
Why is she considered important other than her cool scientific name as well as cool street name? Why is she important?
Well, it's become kind of the gold standard, as it were, of so-called ape man, in this case an ape woman. And if you're convinced that man has evolved from apes, then when you look at the fossil record, you do see humans in the fossil record, and you do see apes in the fossil record. And of course, you have to then be convinced, if you believe in evolution, that at least some of these apes must have turned into people over a period of time. And so they look for anything they can find in an ape by which they might upscale it and make an ape man out of it.
So let's talk about what they look at when they look at Lucy. Dr. Mitten, tell us about Lucy's knee.
Okay, you hear a lot about Lucy's knee. In fact, even whether it existed or not, there is a knee joint that was found separately from Lucy, and that was some distance away, and nobody is suggesting that that knee joint is supposed to go with Lucy, so let's not get excited about that. Technically, Lucy, the specimen called Lucy, doesn't have an intact knee joint, but we have a left femur and we have a right tibia, so you could make a mirror image of the left femur, reconstruct it, and create a knee joint. The thing that's interesting about the knee joint on Lucy is it has what we call a carrying angle, or a valgus. What that means is we're knock-kneed, and so is Lucy. Our femurs, that's the upper part of our leg, the thigh, they converge from our hips towards our knee, so they're coming in at an angle to meet at the knee. And then our tibia and tibula pretty much go straight down from there, the calf of the leg. So if you ran a line up the lower part of our leg from the knee on up, in our thigh, you'd see there's about a 9-degree angle of knock-kneed, if you will. And humans have that. What it does, it keeps our feet together so that when we walk, our weight is always balanced over our feet. If our legs were straight, our feet would be as wide apart as our hips, and we would have to waddle like an ape, throwing our weight from side to side.
Yeah,
if you
want to see some comical videos, Google, apes walking, and they have this big sway back and forth, and they end up falling over on their side. It's kind of funny to watch.
So anyway, that's what makes evolutionists, one of the things excited about Lucy, is Lucy has a carrying angle where most apes and monkeys have straight legs. They go straight down, so their feet are some distance apart, requiring them to waddle from left to right as they walk to keep their weight over the planted foot. So the question is that in fact unique to Lucy? Does that suggest Lucy is an ape that was becoming a human?
Dr. Mitten, when we come back on the other side of the break, will you be able to answer your own question that you just asked about
Sure
Lucy and her knee, because we're finishing up this segment. And we're not going to do it all in the next segment, but I'm also going to ask Dr. Mitten about Lucy's feet, her pelvis, her hands, maybe her vertebrae, and maybe even, does she have footprints? We'll try to get into all that on Backpack Radio. Coming back with Dr. David Mitten. And we're talking to Dr. David Mitten, who is retired but now works for the Creation Museum in the Cincinnati area, and he likes to give talks about Lucy. He has one online I encourage you to watch called Lucy, She's No Lady. So, Dr. Mitten, you told us a little bit about her knee, why it was important, and you asked some questions you were going to answer. What are those questions and answer, David Mitten?
Okay, so the argument is that angle at the knee that makes Lucy knock-kneed the way we humans are knock-kneed is evidence, according to evolutionists, that Lucy was becoming human and walking as we do. The question is, are there any living apes that have the same kind of a carrying angle? And the answer is yes.
Who are they?
The orangutan and the spider monkey are knock-kneed just as we humans are, and they don't walk the way we do at all. They still waddle from side to side, and there are other reasons in their anatomy, mainly their hips, that make them waddle from side to side as they walk. So that is not evidence that Lucy was becoming human or walking like a human just because she has that knock-kneed configuration that we do see in humans, because we see it in some apes.
Because the big deal about Lucy from an evolutionist perspective is, generally speaking, correct me if I'm wrong, they would say, she's the best evidence we have for the first primates to begin walking upright.
Well, now, of course, they have Australopithecus remitis, yet another creature that'll probably replace Lucy down the line as the fossil of choice. But it's another Australopithecine, and the evidence that they walked upright is simply not exclusively upright. Now, even any ape or monkey can go a little ways on two legs.
Her
not
feet.
The big gait we have.
Lucy's feet, though, Dr. David Mitten. What about those?
Well, you know, there was a study done by Stern and Sussman some years ago, actually not long after they found Lucy. And what they did was to look at the toes of Lucy, and there are other Australopithecines of the same species, afarensis, as Lucy. So Lucy isn't the only specimen that they're looking at. And the toes are highly curved like you would see in an ape. These are not feet that you would ever confuse with a human. When they start talking about how human Lucy's feet looked, they're really talking about footprints that were found by Mary Leakey in Lotoli, Tanzania, about a year before they found Lucy. And they argue that these footprints are the same age as Lucy, 3.6 million years old, according to evolutionists, and that Lucy made those footprints. Well, the footprints that Mary Leakey found 1,000 miles away, by the way, in Tanzania, 1,000 miles from Ethiopia, those footprints are, in my mind, unquestionably human.
Okay.
And they weren't made by Lucy.
Well, what's the reason they say they were made by Lucy? Or I think they more accurately would, they say her kind, right? They say
right, not Lucy herself, but a creature like Lucy. The reason they say that is because the dating on these footprints, 3.6 million years, according to evolutionists, is supposed to be approximately the dating for Lucy. And so, although Lotoli, Tanzania, as they say, is 1,000 miles away from the Hadar region of Ethiopia, where they find the Lucy-type creatures, they are arguing that Lucy made those footprints. Now, Mary Leakey didn't agree with that, by the way.
Okay.
She was never convinced that a creature like Lucy made the footprints.
Let me ask this. Have they found any Lucy, some of her homies, have they found any of her people's footprints or skeletons out in Tanzania, or are they all from Ethiopia?
Bingo. Good question. That's exactly, of course, what they addressed. It was embarrassing. All of the creatures like Lucy are known as Hadar Australopithecines because they're found in the Hadar region of Ethiopia. So what they did is they went down on that 1,000-mile trip, hunted through bone boxes of various fossil collectors, came up with a fragment of mandible that had been dismissed as pretty much just ape, declared that to be Lucy, in fact, made that little bone fragment the reference standard for the creature Australopithecus afarensis. So, and that's an attempt to place Lucy where the footprints are.
So you're saying they found a tooth on the
a piece of mandible.
Okay, in between.
Lower jaw.
Okay, so in between where they found the actual Lucy and where they found what they say are some of her people's footprints, they found a lower jaw in between there and said.
Well, they found it right down in that region of of Tanzania, where the footprints are.
Okay, well, interesting stuff. When we come back, would you be able to tell us about her pelvis, her hands, and maybe her vertebrae?
Yep, that'll be good.
All right, Backpack Radio talking to Dr. David Mitten, discussing Lucy and her homies. And we've been talking to Dr. David Mitten as well about Lucy, a key piece of evidence from the evolutionary paradigm, they would say. Look, you got primates beginning to walk upright, and Lucy's a good example of that, I believe they would say. And we're asking them some questions about her anatomy, because that discussion becomes important if you say, how do you walk? Do you walk on all fours? Do you walk on twos? Do you switch? What do you do? All right, so Dr. David Mitten, we are back on the phone with you. Do you want to summarize any of what you've said? We're going to ask you about her pelvis, her hands, and her vertebrae. But what's the big picture on Lucy before we go any further? You know, what's the big takeaway you want to make sure people get before they get lost in the details of this skeletal fragment and that? What's the big picture?
Okay, well, Lucy is an extinct ape. An ape is basically a monkey without a tail. Monkeys have tails, apes don't. She's a primate, which would mean opposable thumb, as all apes, monkeys, and humans are. So I believe it's an extinct ape. It would probably most closely resemble a gorilla. Certainly the lower jaw, the mandible, is very similar to a gorilla in Lucy and not at all like the human or even the chimp mandible. So we have an extinct ape here. It was only about 4 feet tall. It was a little creature. And I don't believe that it had walked with a gait as we do, and it certainly didn't have hands that looked like our hands. And I could give you lots of reasons why I believe it was primarily a tree dweller with suspensory-adapted fingers that occasionally walked on the land.
Now, at the museum, you've got a display of Lucy. What do the evolutionists say about your display?
I think one of them called it sacrilege. I'm not sure what that is for an evolutionist.
Right.
But, our Lucy is knuckle-walking, and that's a bit of a downer for, I think, most evolutionists. But, you know, we do something a lot of museums don't do. We actually cite the scientific literature in the exhibit, giving reasons why we portray the specimen as we do. So, for example, our Lucy is knuckle-walking, not walking like a Marine drill sergeant the way she usually is shown in other museums. But you can go to a paper published by Richmond and Strait in Nature on March 23rd of 2000, and there you can read that these evolutionists, having studied the wrist bones of Lucy, say that Lucy had wrists, and I'm quoting, capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking, end quote. So what do wrist bones look like that lock? Well, they kind of slide together to make a kind of a solidified mass. And these particular evolutionists believe they see that in the wrist of Lucy. Certainly Lucy's fingers were long and highly curved. They were not straight. A paper published by Richmond and by Stern and Sussman in 1983 in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, volume 60, page 279, said that Lucy had long, curved fingers, not at all like the straight fingers of humans.
Yeah, I've got a book here called Science and Human Origins, and they quote Mark Collard and Leslie Alo in an article in Nature, and here's what they say, that Lucy, much of the rest of her body, was, here's a quote, quite ape-like, and end quote, especially with respect to the, quote, relatively long and curved fingers, relatively long arms, and funnel-shaped chest, end quote. And the article also says there's, quote, good evidence from Lucy's hand bones that her species, quote, knuckle-walked as chimps and gorillas do today. So we want to say that she's an extinct ape with some slightly unique anatomical features, but nothing that different than what you could still see today as you look at, say, for example, orangutans?
That's correct. For example, the enamel on the teeth of Lucy is relatively thicker than the enamel on most apes, which is very thin. But there again, you see this variability among living apes. Some have thicker enamel than others. So you have to look at the intense bias the evolutionist has to find at least some ape that can be elevated into the, in quotes, ape-man status. And they do this by looking for anything they can find. Is that foot possibly a little human-like in any way? Is that hand human-like in any way? So there is a very, very significant observer bias here that causes the evolutionists to try to find something human-like in the fossil apes that we have, because if they don't find it, that would be embarrassing to their position.
Well, so is it like this? If evolution is your pre-existing paradigm, if evolution is already your paradigm, when you see any features that you see as anatomically similar, you're going to say, look, here's proof or evidence of common ancestry because of your pre-existing paradigm. That's how you interpret the data, whereas a creationist who sees different distinct kinds created by God, you're going to say there's some similarities, but that doesn't prove anything. Does something have to do with your preconceived notion about how things got here?
Oh, absolutely. We all bring biases to this issue. As I always used to say, it's not a question of who's biased and who isn't biased, but whose bias is the best bias to be biased by. Be
right.
mind-winded.
That's what I always say. Well, so we've talked about our hands. We haven't talked about our pelvis and our vertebrae. Can we do that as well?
Yeah, the pelvis is really important. If I had to pick one bone out of the body, if we're talking about an upright walking individual that walks as a human, the pelvis would be the bone. It would be the go-to part of the anatomy. If you don't have human hips, you can't walk like a human. Simple as that. And ape hips are easy to distinguish from human hips. If you look at a skeleton of a chimp or something like that, any other primate other than the human, you'll notice that the hip bones, what we call the iliac blade, that's the part of your hip bone you can feel just under your belt if you feel on your hip there. On humans, these iliac blades kind of wrap around and come forward. If you look down from the top, it would look like the handlebars of a tricycle, that kind of a curve around handlebar on a tricycle.
Right.
If you looked from the top down at the hips of an ape, they would look like the handlebars of a scooter. They just go straight out, left and right. If you have that kind of a hip, you can't walk like a human. And the reason for that is a particular muscle that attaches to the outer surface of the hip bone. It's called the gluteus medius. You probably heard of the gluteus maximus. You're sitting on it.
Mm-hmm.
But the gluteus medius is really more important for walking. And because those hip bones wrap around, as you feel they do under your belt, if you feel there, that gluteus medius goes down each side of your body like a pair of holsters. If you could look through your body and see them underneath, look like a pair of holsters. And they attach to a big bump on your femur called the greater trochanter. When they contract, your leg goes out. Now, what happens when we walk, when we lift our left foot, our left hip would drop normally because we have ball socket joints. But it doesn't drop because the right gluteus medius contracts. When we lift our right leg, then the left one contracts. And so we can walk keeping our hips parallel to the ground. With the ape, the gluteus medius goes down the back of the animal because the hip bones are sticking straight out. And so they cannot serve to keep the hip from dropping. That's another reason why when an ape walks, it always has to throw the weight left and right over the planted foot. The typical waddling ape walk. Now, what kind of hips does Lucy have? Unquestionably, the ape-like hip.
What makes you say that?
Because the iliac blades, which we do have, I mean, that is one part of Lucy we have. We have the left side, not the right, but we have the sacrum. We have the iliac blade, and we can see that it sticks out, and evolutionists are aware of this. In fact, one evolutionist, paleontologist, has gone so far as to actually take a cast of Lucy's hips, cut it up in pieces, and rearrange the pieces to try to make a human hip out of it. Because he knows full well, as long as those hip bones stick straight out like an ape, you can't walk as a human does.
So if you say what you just said to an evolutionist about Lucy's hips, what do they say back?
Well, I'm sure they would disagree. They would argue that there's some hint of a curvature, or if you take that the hip was crushed during fossilization, which indeed it was, and that if you go in and you take it apart, you can show that it can be put together in a more human-like configuration.
Is that the video where you've got the guy taking a saw to a cast of her? Is that what's going on there? Yeah,
that's exactly what you see. This was a video that was on Omni Television several years ago. Owen Lovejoy, who was a very well-known human paleoanthropologist, actually makes a plaster cast of Lucy's hips. And if you'll notice, he doesn't just cut the broken pieces apart. That would be fair, to go in and cut wherever you see there's a fracture and try to rearrange the piece. But he literally removes material. In other words, he has an objective. He wants an ape hip, and he literally carves one out. And what this is doing is taking your starting biases and treating your data in a way to make it meet your expectations.
Hey, Jeremy, can you bring me up on my iPad? Here we go. Let's play this clip real quick.
But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died.
That kind of sounds a little painful, that whole thing. Will sound a little painful there. But there's a clip of that. Now, Dr. David Mitten, I kept my first guest on, Jordan Worley. Jordan, you have a question for Dr. David Mitten about Lucy and all that?
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Mitten, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. So, actually, one of the questions I had in general is, what are some principles for examining or interrogating some of the supposed evidence for transitional forms from a Christian perspective? So, like, if you hear something on the news, what are some of the things that you start asking about transitional forms?
Good question.
Okay, good question. Let's just focus just on what we've been talking about, human evolution. It's very easy to tell a ape head, say an ape skull, because they usually show you skulls, from a human skull. One of the easiest parts, in fact, it's so easy it sort of falls in the category of duh, is when you look at any ape skull from the side, you'll notice the face is sloped, steeply sloped. When you look at a human skull from the side, the face is vertical. Now, vertical compared to what? Vertical compared to the cheekbones. It's called the zygomatic arch. It's that bone right there in your cheek that you break if you fall on the side of your head. That bone is perpendicular to the face, whereas on any ape, it's a steep slope. And this is so obvious. You ought to be able to look at any skull and tell whether it's an ape or a human in a fraction of a second. Another difference between apes and humans, when you see pictures of ape men in the magazines and what have you, is the forehead. The forehead of apes is absolutely flat, where human, our forehead is curved. And because it's curved, the orbits of our eyes are cut way back on the side, giving us good peripheral vision. And you can look right into the orbit from the side of a human. But if you look at any ape, that bone on the outer edge of the orbit comes way forward, cutting into their peripheral vision. You can hardly see they have eye sockets viewed from the side. Another difference is cranial capacity. The normal range of human cranial capacity varies with the height of the individual and the size. So from a midget, pygmy, something like that, it might be about 700 cc's up to about 2 liters. Whereas you will not find any apes big enough to have a brain larger than about 500 cc's.
David Mitten, thank you. You just shared with us some basic so basically, that was Anthropology 101 right there at the end of Backpack Radio. Well, Jordan, thank you for joining us today. Good question. It was good to have you, man. I'd like to get you back, talk about some Jehovah's Witness sometime. And Dr. David Mitten, thank you for joining us today on Backpack Radio and breaking down Lucy.
My pleasure.
All right. Saying sayonara. This is Backpack Radio. What's up, y'all? My name's Vocab Malone. Doctrine, theology, apologetics every week with a hip-hop vibe. And right there's a group called Destiny Lab.